So welcome, thank you for coming to our talk on Operation Cookie Monster. I'm Amanda Knudsen. I'm a supervisory special agent with the FBI. I'm assigned to the Milwaukee field office. I run the cyber squad out there, and joined with me I have Tom Gathman. He's an intelligence analyst and he works on my squad, and he worked this investigation from start to finish. So I'm going to actually pass it off to him to get us started.
Great, thank you. Again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I know there's a lot of good presentations all occurring simultaneously, so it does mean a lot to us that you are here. Of course, we have our mandatory disclaimer slide and our mandatory government outline slide. But in summary, we're going to go into the background of Genesis Market, what it was, talk about our investigation and the operation that we ran, whether the operation was successful, and then some lessons learned, application, and some resources for everyone in the room. So before we get into the background of the actual marketplace, there's a couple things that we need to talk about, kind of level set, as well as provide context for why and how we chose to approach this investigation. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the cybercrime ecosystem, and this is that ecosystem comprised of financially motivated cyber criminals. This is not including state actors, government-sponsored actors, etc. But what we've seen is over the past decade or so, right, a big explosion of this ecosystem, a proliferation of this ecosystem into a very interconnected, organized entity that largely resembles a pyramid, where at the top you've got these subject matter experts and these key service providers. Okay, so subject matter experts, those individuals developing new malware, identifying new vulnerabilities, really progressing cyber criminals, TTPs, tactics, techniques, procedures, and these key service providers. These are those individuals who are providing services like communications platforms, forums, financial platforms, services that enable these lower rungs, these sophisticated and unsophisticated users to conduct cybercrime, and have really lowered the barrier to entry to cybercrime and increased the accessibility of lower level cyber criminals. Now here in the FBI, we try and put our investigative focus at these top two rungs, okay? That doesn't mean we ignore the bottom two. It doesn't mean we ignore victims. But what it does mean is that we have found we can impose the most risk, the most consequences on these cyber criminals by affecting those individuals that sit kind of at the top of this pyramid. And this investigation kind of personifies and exemplifies these principles. Another thing to mention before we get into the marketplace is the concept of digital fingerprints. So just like all humans have unique physical fingerprints, digital devices also maintain their own unique digital fingerprint comprised of potentially thousands of lines of data about the machine, things such as IP address, operating system, and these often get very, very granular, right? Screen height, available height, so accounting for taskbar, things like whether there's a battery, is it plugged in, etc. And these form, like I said, a unique fingerprint for that machine. And these fingerprints are used by businesses and corporations in what we call risk-based authentication, among other things, where I go to log into, for example, my bank, and my bank fingerprints my device, and when I go to log in the second time, it checks my current fingerprint against what they have on file, and if it matches, it lets me in, and if it doesn't, maybe it says, hey, I don't know if you are actually Tom. Can you give us another form of authentication, identification, usually in the way of a multi-factor, another factor. This is all well and good from the perspective of fraud prevention. It made cybercrime more difficult to perpetrate, to conduct. Cyber criminals are good, they evolve, they adapt. And this is where Genesis Market came into play. So Genesis Market was a marketplace founded in approximately 2017, kind of really took off in 2018. And what they trafficked in were stolen credentials, so usernames, passwords, cookies. But what made them unique and what made them stand out amongst other similar platforms at that time was they also decided, let us steal these digital fingerprints and maybe, right, that issue of risk-based authentication and multi-factor authentication, if we can steal those fingerprints, maybe that'll help us circumvent that. And so in addition to that, they developed a proprietary emulation software by way of a Chromium plugin. It was called Genesis Security, as well as a proprietary browser, Chrome-based browser called Genesium. And what this software did was allow the users of that marketplace to take and ingest a victim's fingerprint into their browser, into their machine, effectively emulating a victim down to almost the hardware level, right? And this resulted in oftentimes successful bypass of multi-factor authentication. Now, this marketplace existed on the ClearNet and the DarkNet, was also an invite-only marketplace. So what did that marketplace look like? This is a shot of the market. You can see it's very slick. It looks like many of the e-commerce platforms, very easy to use. And this is actually a video, and in this video what we're going to do is search for bots with PayPal.com credentials. Now, when I say bot moving forward in this presentation, the way that Genesis defined a bot was not the common nomenclature. It wasn't a machine under attacker control or a machine with, with my mic. We're doing the handheld, folks. We're pivoting. You want me to take this one off?
Leave it on.
Double mic? Okay. Okay. All right. All right. We've got the second to go. All right. The video played already, but okay, that's okay. One of the FBI's mottos is "Be flexible." So let us flex out. So when I talk about a bot, and when Amanda talks about a bot in this presentation, we don't mean the traditional definition. The way that Genesis defined a bot was essentially a victim and all of their subsequent credentials and digital fingerprints. So when we say bot, that's what we mean, not necessarily computer under attacker control. What we saw up here is when we searched for bots with PayPal.com credentials, they all appeared on that screen as we scrolled through. A couple things I want to highlight. One on the right, there's a bold number. It might be pretty small for you guys in the back, but this was the price of the bots. And we found that these range from a couple dollars to a couple hundred. This was determined via a proprietary algorithm that Genesis developed. There's a lot that went into it, but more or less it was how successful do we think the bots are going to be at circumventing and bypassing some of these safeguards in place, what types of credentials do they have, et cetera, and other things. But I also want to draw attention to this bottom number. It's about 20,000 or so bots when we ran this query that had PayPal.com credentials. Once a credential or a bot was purchased off of this marketplace, it was removed from the marketplace. So I, as a user, purchased that bot. I'm the only one with sole access to that bot. So these 20,000, that just means that when we ran this search, there were 20,000 up for grabs. That says nothing about those that had already been purchased and nothing about those that may be ingested into the market in the future. And when we buy a bot, what do we get access to? We have access to all of the credentials or resources, as Genesis called them, associated with that victim. We had their credentials in plain text, as well as which browser they were infiltrated or exfiltrated from, But importantly, we have access to this fingerprint. That's what I mentioned earlier. And on this screen here, I have highlighted this button that says Download in Genesis Security. And it was almost as easy, and we'll see that in a slide, as clicking that button to take that fingerprint and ingest it into the browser. This is going to be a video of that. And what's going to happen here is we're going to run a script in this browser. We're going to see a fingerprint pop up as well as a hash. There's the hash, there's the fingerprint, key value pairs. We're going to enable the plugin, Genesis Security, like I mentioned earlier. Click that plugin, click fingerprint, so that's 2 clicks. We're going to run that script. And you can see that the hash is completely different, the fingerprint's completely different, key value pairs completely different. Turn that plugin back off, run it again, the script, and we're back to that original fingerprint. And that's how easy this software was to use. And that's why when we go back to that pyramid that we discussed in lowering the barrier of entry for those individuals at the bottom of that pyramid, this is a perfect example of how these services have lowered that barrier and made this much, much easier to do and thus proliferated throughout the cybercriminal underground. So kind of pivoting to victim risk and exposure and why we got involved in this and where our concerns were. Over the lifetime of this marketplace, they infected approximately 1.5 million bots, and that is data that was taken approximately 1 year before our takedown, so likely this was closer to 1.8 million, maybe 2. Approximately 2 million identities compromised and around 80 million credentials stolen. If we look at where the victims were, they were worldwide. Nearly every single country was represented except for Russia and the surrounding countries, so you can guess where this platform was based. Victim industries, all manner of critical infrastructure, nearly every single industry of any kind was represented in this marketplace. And then if we look at users, and Amanda will get a little more granular on this in a few slides, like I said, we saw everyone from absolute novice beginners all the way through foremost experts on this marketplace. But really our biggest concern with this marketplace was its role as an initial access broker, more or less, right? We all know that in a cyber attack, one of the first steps is gaining that initial access. And this enables things like ransomware, IP theft, fraud, all these traditional cyber crime types that we think about. You'll notice on the slide right now, we have espionage up there as well, and that's not normally traditionally associated with these other things on the slide. But what's interesting is we did a query for one of our foreign allies' defense domains, government defense domains, and when we ran that query, there were 180 bots for sale that had those defense credentials. And again, once a bot is purchased, it's off the market. So that just means at this point in time, there were 180 or so available. Doesn't mean some hadn't already been purchased, more wouldn't be ingested in the future. And it wasn't just this one ally that had credentials in the marketplace. It was nearly every single one of our government countries' allies, as well as many, many U.S. government agencies had credentials in this marketplace as well, right? So outside of even the cyber criminal realm, we had major concerns from a national security perspective. As a quick example, too, as far as IP theft and fraud, right? Sometimes we think of those as kind of lower level criminal activity, maybe not as much of an impact, but this is an example of an event that happened in June 2021, and this is according to public reporting, but the Lapsus group compromised a company in the United States and were able to exfiltrate approximately 750 gigabytes of source code, API keys, and other intellectual property. And according to Lapsus, they indicated that they had gotten initial access via a bot that they purchased for $10 on Genesis Market. Now, this bot enabled them to access a third-party application that was tied to that company. They were able to socially engineer their way in, and like I said, exfiltrate 750 gigabytes of intellectual property. So $10, 750 gigabytes, not a bad return on investment. So with that, that's the background of the case of the Genesis Market. To actually go into the investigation, I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Right, I'll use this mic too, just in case mine's not working. So, thank you, Tom. So now that we know what Genesis Market was and why it was such an issue, I'm going to try to illuminate for you the early stages of our investigation and how we initially started it. So in Milwaukee, we really do focus on those key criminal services that Tom talked about early on, the top of that pyramid, because we believe that that is going to have the biggest impact on the cybercriminal ecosystem. So it's natural for my agents to be looking for services or criminal groups like this in order to open investigations on. So that is what happened in this case. I had a very motivated case agent that I'll reference throughout this investigation. But he identified Genesis Market relatively early on, and we initiated our investigation in 2018, shortly after Genesis actually opened its doors. So early on, when we opened our investigation, as Tom briefly mentioned, this was an invitation-only site, so you couldn't just get on it without an invitation. So one of the first things we had to do was get an invitation. We created accounts on Genesis, and we deposited some Bitcoin so that we could purchase evidence. The next step was for us to get venue in Wisconsin. So what venue means is essentially showing that it is impacting our area of responsibility. So oftentimes we will get the question, why is the Milwaukee field office working this case? Like, why Wisconsin? And I get it. We are a small field office in a small city in the Midwest, and most people, when they think of major FBI investigations, they're probably not thinking of FBI Milwaukee. We are a flyover state, and most people don't know the difference between Milwaukee and Minneapolis. So I get that question often, but the answer to that is really in the way that the FBI targets and goes after cyber criminals. we don't necessarily adhere to those traditional areas of responsibility for us that is the state of Wisconsin. We have the flexibility to open on cases that are bigger than just our state or our area. And so that was the case here with Genesis. So we initiated this case. Obviously, it impacts Wisconsin. It impacts almost every state across the country and almost every country in the world, like Tom mentioned. But the way that our Department of Justice works, we do have to identify some victims in our area. So that is the next step. What we did, identified here, if you can see it in red, some Wisconsin-based victims. My incredibly motivated case agent knew that one of the biggest things that we needed to do was identify where the back-end server was so we could get our hands on that. So he spent time early on traversing the proxies and trying to identify that. And luckily he did, and luckily it was identified to be in a country where we had a cooperative relationship with. So we were able to travel out overseas to make an image of this server in 2020, about December 2020. And when we did, we were able to identify that at that time, there were about 33,000 users and about 900,000 victims on the site. So now, again, these users, these are the criminals that have created accounts on Genesis, purchased bots, use it for fraud or for other types of cybercrime, ransomware attacks, computer intrusions, theft of intellectual property, that kind of thing. So at that time, there were 33,000 users. So now the way that we had to collect that image, we knew that there was a good chance that the administrators of Genesis would identify that something weird had happened on their server. So we fully expected that. So shortly after our operation, their service actually went down and they messaged to their users, to their customers, that they are upgrading their servers and that they'd be back in about a week. But what they also did was they pointed out that they are going to be deleting duplicate accounts or suspicious accounts, and then they also warned their users, their customers, about potential scammers. So to us, this indicated that they really did suspect something happened that maybe had something to do with law enforcement action. So not a week later, but about a month later, in January of 2021, Genesis did return. So again, my case agent focused efforts on trying to identify where the new backend was. Luckily, it was located again in a separate country on different infrastructure, but again, we had a cooperative relationship with this country, so we were able to travel out again and take an image of this server. So this time around, we noted that their operational security was better than it was the first time around. But since we had some really talented special agents and computer scientists on the ground, we were able to get an unencrypted image on this server as well. So this time, about 18 months later, we had about 59,000 users. So it went from 33,000 to 59 in about 18 months. And then the victims also increased from 900,000 to about 1.5 million. So we did an assessment of the users, and Tom briefly mentioned this. We found basically three groupings of people. We had the early stage hackers, the script kiddies, the people that weren't super technical but just kind of dipping their toe in. Then we had the legitimate hackers that were involved in ransomware and computer intrusions, the people that we really expected to be on this site. But then we also had a large group of gangs and traditional criminal groups that were involved in, say, the sale of drugs and guns. And although it wasn't unexpected to see these types of criminals on the dark web in order to sell or purchase contraband or something like that, it was interesting to see that they were using Genesis for fraud to generate revenue, which was unexpected to see them on this type of platform. So at this point, we needed to determine how we were going to go after Genesis Market in order to dismantle it. So obviously it's our job at the FBI to go after these cyber criminals, get to the attribution, and do whatever we can to not just disrupt them, but to dismantle them so that they can't come back or that they don't come back quickly right after we take action. So we really thoughtfully developed our plan, which we called Operation Cookie Monster, with our challenge in mind. And the challenge that we face is that as law enforcement in the United States, we are charged with protecting the US citizens within our country. But they are being targeted by individuals that are not in our country. They are using infrastructure that is not in our country. They're using tools that they are shifting their tactics quickly. And so we need to figure out a way that we can combat this ever-changing threat that we don't necessarily have jurisdictional reach into, and it's not an easy task. So the number one thing that we knew we had to do was that no one law enforcement agency can take out an organization like this on their own. It's just absolutely not possible. So we planned from the beginning for this to be a multinational takedown. So we had over 16 countries help us in this investigation. So they either helped with the investigation itself or they participated in the takedown. But again, this was a main the priority for us was to recruit other law enforcement agencies across the world to help us with this. Like I said, our goal was not to just disrupt Genesis, but we wanted true dismantlement so that they couldn't quickly pivot and reconstitute. So that's where our shift in the way that we targeted Genesis from what we traditionally had done in the FBI with takedowns. So traditionally, in most takedowns up to this point, we really focused on two pillars. So the administrators of the criminal service, obviously, and then the infrastructure that they use. So the goal is to take out the administrators and the infrastructure at the same time, and then we can dismantle the organization. But if you can imagine, this is not very simple. Like Tom said, this infrastructure and these individuals are not within our reach. So there is a good chance that even if we do our best plans, we might not get both of these at the same time, which is really what's necessary to have the dismantlement. So we had to be creative and figure out what could we do that could have impact if we can't get those two pillars at the same time. And so that's where our plan came in to target the users of the service. So now this is something that hadn't really been done before. In most takedowns, we didn't go after the users of the service. We mostly focused on the administrators. But we knew that Genesis's reputation to have anonymity for their users, to keep their information safe from law enforcement was a big part of their reputation. And also their ability to run unimpeded and to constantly be providing fresh bots. So we thought maybe if we went after the users, we could discredit Genesis and really shine a light on the fallible nature of them being able to actually protect their users from law enforcement. Because if you can imagine, at this point, we had already gone out twice and made images of their back end. We had all of this user information, so we knew what they were selling was not actually the case. So this was the foundation of what they operated on, and we thought if we could target the users, we could potentially crack that foundation. So I'm going to pass it back over to Tom to talk about how we use the data we collected from those searches to go after those users.
Seamless handoff.
Kind of.
Yeah, so speaking about that third pillar, kind of that new novel way to approach these investigations, we had a problem, right? We had, like Amanda mentioned, almost 60,000 users. These users were spread across dozens of different countries. Their OPSEC levels varied from little to, as much as you've ever seen. And this data set that had all this information in it was massive. This kind of like light portion of the slide in the back is the ERD, or entity relationship diagram, for their back-end database, and it contained dozens of tables and over 1 billion lines of data. So the question really became kind of twofold. One, how do we identify users in true name on a platform that is supposed to be providing them anonymity and via a group, right, that prides themselves on their operational security and anonymity? And then two, once we have identified users, how do we prioritize which ones to target? Because the reality is, even with all the worldwide resources, investigating, targeting 60,000 users is just not feasible. And really the solution to this was partnership, and that's going to be a theme throughout kind of the rest of this presentation, is how important partnership is. And in this case, international partnership was key to this. So, as Amanda mentioned, as you saw in the Operation Cookie Monster slide, a lot of our partners were European countries, European-based. And so Europol, which is the EU's law enforcement agency, was really the perfect partner for this. And they exist really to serve and coordinate efforts amongst the EU member states. And so they kind of became our foundation for what we did over there. And so prior to calling in assistance with our Europol partners and European country partners, we said, well, how can we take these 60,000 subjects and maybe first triage this, filter it down a little bit, right? So we did kind of the basic things. Let's get rid of potential duplicate accounts, individuals who are on the marketplace but didn't really buy anything. You know, that's not really a crime yet, so are we really going to target them? Probably not. We do that initial triage, and then now, when we filtered that down, how do we filter it down even more, right? So we can't get into the extent of the full methodology that we employed, but it was a lot of correlative analysis, looking at things like geographic location, money flows, how much was put in, where did that money go, things like operational security levels. There were some people with no operational security, some with a ton, right? If we only target those with no operational security, are we really impacting the user base? If we go after those with the top level, are we going to identify all of them? Hit or miss, right? So after that, we actually went overseas to what we call a sprint with Europol. And so it was us and a bunch of our European partners getting together and sharing our best practices for how to deal with this data set and how to target, right? Because the way that country X or country Y interprets the data and decides to target might differ from how we decide to target the data. We have different cultures, we have different mindsets, different ways of thinking, and really by getting everyone together in the same room, in the same place, allowed for the sharing of these best practices and allowed us to really standardize a process for identification and ultimately whittle this down into an achievable target base that was resource feasible as far as going after these users. And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention our work with private sector partners. So John Fokker from Trellix actually presented yesterday on the Trellix's role in Genesis Market. But throughout this investigation, we worked with a number of private sector partners. Many are on the slide, and there are some more. Like Amanda mentioned, there is no one organization based either here or overseas, either government or private, that can solely impact the cybercriminal ecosystem the way we can when we all work together, right? It requires cooperation amongst U.S. government agencies, amongst our government and other country governments, and amongst that public sector and the private sector. And frankly, without the help of the private sector in this investigation, it would not have been successful. I'm 100% confident on that. I'm an analyst. We generally deal not in that level of confidence, but in this case, 100%. So, I mean, we had help with all manner of aspects of this investigation: malware analysis, data parsing, financial analysis, victim notification, which was huge because remember, there were 80,000 different stolen credentials in that marketplace, identification. So, like I said, all manner of this investigation augmented significantly because of our partnerships with private sector. So this kind of leads us up to the takedown itself, right? Our goal is that global takedown. We'd gone through multi-year investigation, identified all of these users, and that day of the coordinated global takedown had arrived. So this video is produced by the Dutch National Police. It's going to lead us into that takedown, and then Amanda will walk us through it.
It's not just handing over cases to the other cybercrime teams. He's also called in the assistance of cybersecurity companies and of Microsoft.
We zijn hier vanmorgen op uitnodiging van de politie gekomen om te kijken of we technische expertise kunnen bieden in een oplossing bieden voor mensen die geïnfecteerd zijn.
En wij willen onze miljoenen sensoren gebruiken in de wereld om deze malware beter te detecteren en op te schonen voor alle slachtoffers.
Right. We have the suspects in our sights and Genesis Market is under control. Not only in the Netherlands, but all around the world, police forces are primed and ready to arrest suspects. It's time for action.
Okay, so as you saw from that video, on April 4th into the 5th of 2023, so last year, we executed Operation Cookie Monster, and we did that in a coordinated fashion with all of our foreign partners. And what we did was we followed the sun, and we did this for officer safety purposes. So beginning on the 4th, we started in Europe, and then went over to North America, and then across over into Australia on their morning of the 5th. So for a total of 424 law enforcement actions in a single day. So this includes interviews, arrests, and search warrants of these users across the world. At the same time, DOJ and FBI, we seized the domains that Genesis used and then redirected to this splash page here. So we understand that this, although it severed their connection to the ClearNet, this did not remove them from their Tor site, and Tom is actually going to address that next. But here on the splash page, you'll see at the bottom all of our partners that helped with this operation. Also, we provided a means for the public to search to see if their information was for sale on Genesis, if they were victims of Genesis. And we did this through partnering with Have I Been Pwned, so the public could go on that website, search their own identifiers, and see if their stuff was on that site. At the same time, we coordinated with the Department of Treasury, and they sanctioned Genesis concurrently with our takedown and our seizure of the domains. So now going back to the pillars, where did we end up with that? So with the administrators, that is ongoing, so that is all I can say about the administrators. The users, as you see, we apprehended a lot of users during the actual takedown. A lot of users have been targeted since the takedown in this past year, and then we still have user cases to this date that are open. So that also is ongoing. And then with the infrastructure, we were able to seize some of the infrastructure, but not all of the infrastructure. But what we really found was that our plan, our assessment in targeting the users to discredit Genesis really worked. And the way that we did that was not only did we have the massive takedown, but we also made media part of our plan. So we kind of call that our unofficial 4th pillar, if you will. Because immediately following the takedown, DOJ put out a press release, and then we also did a lot of media engagements in order for that message to get out that Genesis Market users were targeted and arrested, and really put that message out there that Genesis failed at keeping their information safe like they said they would. So you see here, we really drove home the message that we had access to the user information to discredit Genesis. And this message was echoed by our foreign law enforcement partners in their own press releases, and then also in international media. So really what we wanted to do was push this message out there so that the rest of the users and anybody else that potentially would want to use Genesis would realize that they can't keep their information safe. They won't have anonymity on this service, so they're not going to use it. So even though we weren't able to necessarily take out the other 2 pillars, the infrastructure and the administrators simultaneously, we did find that we dismantled Genesis just because the users lost their confidence in them and turned away from them. So I'm going to pass it back over to Tom to talk about that impact.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that was a little bit of a spoiler for my next section, but it's okay, we'll make it. Right, we went through the multi-year investigation. We affected the pillars, some more than others. What happened? What was the follow-up? So this is a post on Genesis Market shortly after the takedown. Of course, it's resplendent with Cookie Monster GIFs and memes. GIFs, we'll say both so I don't anger anyone in this room. But you can see they posted shortly after, and they said, you know, our ClearNet sites are gone, but we're still back and better than ever on our Tor domain. So, of course, we're sitting back in the office like, oh, my goodness, did anything that we do matter? Did it affect them in any way? Was there impact? But the reality is that those steps, like Amanda mentioned, that we took did have impact, did have effect. So what we see on this screen, and this is a couple months post-takedown now, is a summary of the bots ingested into the marketplace in the previous month. Now, normally this number, it's 128 up here. Normally this number was in the thousands to tens of thousands per month. You can see it's only 128. You can see in the previous week, 0 bots were ingested. There are also users posting on the marketplace saying none of these bots work, they're all empty, nothing is working correctly, this marketplace is no longer valid. To Amanda's point about the seeds of distrust and discord amongst the users, we also saw users posting on the market, this might be a trap set by authorities, is this a honeypot? Questioning the authenticity of the marketplace, whether the administrator still had control, whether the government had control, and again, just that distrust was very evident. Because of this, Genesis posts the marketplace for sale on Exploit, which is a Russian underground cyber forum. Shortly after their post for sale, where they indicated they want to sell the whole marketplace, the database and everything, they posted that they had found a buyer. Whether that sale actually occurred or this was a way to save face, essentially an exit scam, remains unclear. However, regardless, shortly following that, their Tor site disappeared, and their accounts on multiple underground cyber forums were also either banned or deleted. And as a result, we considered, and to this day, we have not seen indicators of a Genesis market resurgence. So we consider this a fully successful, at least for the previous year, dismantlement of a large cyber enterprise organization. Yes?
All right, so through this experience, there's some lessons learned. A lot of this is things that we really did already believe, but this really drove home the point that partnerships are absolutely vital. So in this case, and many cases, we would not be able to have the impact that we had if we didn't have our partnerships with our private sector companies, our victims, and our foreign law enforcement partners, as well as our other U.S. government agencies who helped us out on this case. So just like Tom said, nobody's going to be able to do this on their own. This is a whole of society issue, not just a whole of government issue. So partnerships absolutely vital in this case, and honestly all major cyber cases. So creative thinking is also critical. So in this case, like I talked about, targeting the users was really something that we hadn't done before, because when you think about an organization like this, you want to go after the top dogs, and the users are just, the users. But in understanding that we can't always get what we want, we can't always get the administrators and the infrastructure at the same time. We know the realities of how difficult this can be. So we needed to be creative and come up with new ways that we can target these organizations and actually have success. So we know that in this case, targeting the users did work, and that was something that hadn't been done before. But we also know that the cyber criminals are going to constantly be changing their tactics, changing how they do things. So the way that we targeted Genesis here might not work for future operations. And things that we did in the past might not work for Genesis. So we need to continuously be agile in order to keep up with the way that they change their tactics and their procedures in order to elude us. So I'm going to just quickly go over some of these mitigations. For everybody in this room, this is probably not news to anybody. But the way that Genesis was able to get their data, their stolen credentials, wasn't super technical. It wasn't very difficult, I should say. And if victims had their software patched, or if they weren't using pirated software, that would have prevented a lot of that. So we really do push to keep your systems patched, don't use pirated software. But on top of that, for organizations, we really push that everybody, small or large, whatever your organization is, that you should have a cybersecurity strategy. You should have an incident response plan that you're actually practicing, and you should be educating your employees about cybersecurity. And I understand that a lot of smaller organizations might think that they're obscure and that nobody knows about them, or they don't have money to put towards cybersecurity, and they don't really consider themselves targets, so they don't really put in the effort that is required to keep them safe. But we really do push that things like Genesis Market, they were basically an intrusion or a initial access broker, and that lowers the barrier for entry. So a lot of unsophisticated people now can take advantage of things like Genesis Market and generate a lot of fraud, a lot of cybercrime, with not a lot of skills. And honestly, anybody can be a target of opportunity, especially if your information or your employee's information, their credentials and their digital fingerprint are being sold on a marketplace like this. So we really do drive home with organizations, whether they're small or large, that they really do need to consider themselves targets. But the one thing that I really will foot stomp here is the forcing of multi-factor authentication in your organization if you are able to do that. Because Genesis Market essentially exploited the remember me or the save password option and was able to circumvent the multi-factor authentication basically by emulating that victim's machine. So really, if you could force the multi-factor authentication within your organization, would have prevented a lot of this as well. And then lastly, we always like to let everybody know that we would love for all cyber incidences to be reported to our Internet Crime Complaint Center. That's ic3.gov. So this is a centralized location for all cybercrime and internet fraud to be reported to the FBI. And then it'll get disseminated to the proper field office where it belongs. But we also use this as a centralized location to be able to see trends and then also link incidences together that we might not have otherwise. And then also we do publish private industry notifications and other guidance for the public on this site. Some other helpful government resources, I'll just point you to CISA's website. So this is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. They've got a lot of resources on their website, again, with the private industry notifications and messages like that. But they also have a lot of guides and resources, say like checklists before and after an incident. And they also outline the services that they provide, the assessment services, the pen testing, that sort of thing. So if you're interested in any of that, the CISA is a good site for that. And then lastly, NSA also has a site where they publish guides and reporting that is technical in nature and a great resource. Okay, so that concludes our time with you today. I really appreciate everybody taking time to come hear our talk, but before we go, I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge the exceptional work of my case agent and my intelligence team, which includes Mr. Tom Gathman here. I'd like to point out that oftentimes when you see major takedowns or investigations like this within the FBI, especially within cyber, although we had dozens and dozens of people helping and supporting the case, it really is driven by one or two really motivated people. And so that was no exception in this case. I had a single case agent working this from start to finish, and he drove it from the beginning to the end and was not deterred by all of the hurdles that you would expect a major case like this to have. So I'm very proud of them, and I'm excited to see what they do next. And I really appreciate you guys spending time with us today. We will be answering questions out in the hallway afterwards, so to save time. But we're also, us and our colleagues are available at the FBI booth in Moscone South. So thank you very much.